I've got a lot of sharpening tips for you today. I'm right now in the hotel room in Reno, Nevada. I was one of the speakers at the Sharpening Show that the Wolff Industries conducted here. And we had close to 100 people here. Good turnout from, I think, 4 different countries. And I took lots and lots of notes, and really sloppy, but this got me through college. And I want to just go over some of the tips that I learned that I think will be helpful to me, and I assume it'll be helpful to you. So if you pick up 1 or 2 tips out of this, it's going to be worth listening to. And the speakers were Glen Burke from Wolff, Jason Sturm and Zach Sturm from the Edge Pro, and Dennis Brooks. Who else did we have? John Kuipers and Cliff Curry on knives. So I've got some tips on knives. Learned a lot on that. And now the first presentation of the day was Glen Burke, and he actually had 2 presentations. And I'm going to share some of the things I learned from Glen. And tip number 1 is something I've said on some of these YouTube videos, and I had some people, kind of felt like a celebrity this weekend. There were so many people that knew me from my videos. It was flattering, I have to admit. Gene said I was getting a big head. I don't know about that, but Glen Burke's tip was these videos aren't that good. Videos will not give you feedback. Says whatever equipment you decide to buy or use, you need to train with a person that has that equipment. And I agree with that tip. That was tip number 1. Tip number 2, he was doing some corrugating, and I do some hand corrugating. He used the corrugator, and something I didn't know, that when you have burrs that are created from the corrugating or serration, you need to cut them off and not go to the stone to knock them off, because going to the stone can push the burrs back into the serrations, and cutting works better. Tip number 3 is that his standard method of sharpening is to sharpen the thumb blade, sharpen the finger blade, and these are like a standard shear that you're not taking apart. You would push them apart 4 or 5 times and close them, and then go back to and he was doing this on the twice as sharp, go back and hone them, and then cut off the burr. I've used the twice as sharp because I had to use it over in Germany, but I'm not that familiar with it, so I was looking for some tips on that. Tip number 4 also was on the twice as sharp, and he was doing a curve shear. He had a black dot there so that he could line up the whole blade from the tips to the end. Number 5 tip from Glen Burke was on groomer and barber shears. Typically the finger blade is serrated, but on industrial shears the thumb blade is typically serrated. Tip number 6, he said on dog grooming shears, and once again he was using the Hira 2 and the twice as sharp on this. I guess the Hira 2, because he was saying on a typical dog grooming shear, he does it at 80 grit, 60 grit, then he'll cut the burr off in between, go back to 30 grit, and leave that as the hone for the dog grooming shears. And some of the dog grooming shears, he may just stop at 80, depending on how much bite he needs to them. Tip number 7, where he was convexing. His steps on convexing typically is the first step was 30 micron. Remove the scratches at 15 micron, and then the 9 micron was the pre-polish, he called it. But he was pushing the burr off between each step. I thought that was interesting. It looked like he was pushing them off with his finger. I was sitting on the back row, so I couldn't see everything, but that's sort of what it looked like. So that was from Glen. Zach Sturm and Jason, I got 2 pages from the 2 of them, so I'll go through those because this is clipper tips. Tip 1 was he was using the muffin pans to sort things, and I understand why people do that, and most people they do, but I didn't realize they put the clipper blades into the muffin pans to disassemble them, and the little muffin pan holds the clipper blade, and you don't cut yourself, so you're not holding the clipper and trying to unscrew it and cutting your fingers. I thought that was a good tip. Another tip was you want to clean the clipper blades before you sharpen them, because any dirt, if they're badly dirty, because any of the grit that comes off on your wheel can damage your wheel. And then you have to replace the plate or have it resurface more often. So you want to clean them first to protect your wheel. Some of these things you might have known, but some of these things were like aha moments to me. Tip number 3, I've been using like test string and then maybe fur, maybe rabbit fur, and he said he just uses test string, and if the test string test is iffy, then he'll go to the commercial fur or artificial fur and rabbit fur to affirm. But typically they just use the test string unless that looks iffy, and speeds up time. There were a lot of other things I learned. You really need to be at these things to get all the things, but these are just some tips that I learned. Tip number 3, I numbered these wrong. Tip number 4 from Zach is that when you're doing those extra wide pet grooming blades, that they need more hollow to them, and you want to use 2 to 2.5 pounds pressure. So more pressure when you're doing those than you would a regular width blade. And then tip number 5, when he puts the oil on his plate, he puts his finger on it and kind of sees what the fingerprint looks like. And that way he can tell if he's got enough oil, the lard oil on his plate when he's charging it. And number 6, I ran out of paper room, so I turned it upside down and wrote in the margins here. Number 6, when he's got the little wooden block and rubbing in the grit, he's using 10 pounds of pressure. I really hadn't heard exactly how much pressure that is. Number 7, I guess I am. That especially for beginners, after you charge your plate, you probably need to have what he called a sacrificial blade. And the sacrificial blade, you just run it back and forth to kind of, there'll be grit that'll be flying, and it'll just feel different, that first blade. So especially beginners, it might be good just to have a sacrificial blade that you run back and forth once or twice before you actually start sharpening your regular blade. And I told you I wrote in the margins here. Okay, so how often do you charge the plate? It has to do with not how many clipper blades, but how many passes. So they're typically doing about 3 passes per blade, and then you have, of course, the comb and the cutter, each one. So it's about 48 passes back and forth before it's time to charge the plate. And so that may be just a blade or 2 if you're having to take off a lot of metal, if you're working it a lot, or you may get several blades. And it's not just watching the spark pattern, because some of the stainless steel blades don't have sparks. That might be another tip too. So that was all the tips from Zach. Zach's presentation was pretty good. Well, it's more than pretty good. It was very good. Jason made it clear about, and he was talking about the rub block and also the pressure that you're putting on the plate. And he's like, there's a range of tolerances. It's not like there has to be an exact number. There's a goal for all these things, but there's a range that is an engineering range. The crescent shape that you get on a clipper blade when you're on a rub block, a lot of that has to do with the molecules on the outside of the blade are released more than the ones on the inside, which are holding in closer. He really got into some of the physics and chemistry. That was tip 1 and tip 2 from Jason Sturm. Tip 3 is the rub block. When you're using the rub block, actually simulates the seating of the blades when you're and the way the clipper will seat them as they rub together. So if you've been using the rub block, you probably don't have to wait as long when you put the blades on your clipper before you start testing it. Number 4, and Zach mentioned this as well, so this is important, and I'm finding when I train people, they don't do this, and this is an important tip. Tip number 4 is that when you pick the blade up from off the plate, you want to hesitate, like count 1001. You don't have to count to 3, but 1001. Hesitate and make sure you lift it straight up, because if you do any dropping to the front, you start all over and you may not have enough metal to fix it. Tip number 5, when the back of the blade, like back this area of the blade, you're rubbing too much metal off there, that's often caused because either your magnet is too far back or your pressure is too far back. And he made a big deal about how as the truck is overloaded in the back, it'll and I have once had a Volkswagen Rabbit that I loaded with too much stuff in the back, and I'm barely, the front tires would hardly touch. It was quite scary. Tip number 6, if you have like a blade, clipper blade, like a number 4 clipper blade, where you've got the long teeth on the comb, the magnet may be kind of floating above. You've got to make sure that your magnet is lined up with the front rail, so it's like an invisible line going through. So many of us have the magnet too far back, and you've got to make sure that magnet is closer to the front. Another trick I learned from him, this is trick number 7, when he's looking at his clipper blades to see in the light, to see if there's any dark spots, if the grind marks are straight, he puts it kind of under his hand, so there's the color is compared to his hand, and he's turning it back and forth to the light, but having his hand cupping it makes it better than holding it like this. Number 8, on the rub block, it's 3 to 5 pounds of pressure, and you're doing 10 to 12 passes on the rub block. Tip number 9, it takes 3 to 5,000 strokes, clippers going back and forth like this, for a clipper blade to be fully seated. And for an average clipper, that's about a minute. So they really don't do their best cutting till after they've been running for a minute. But that doesn't mean you have to wait that long to test them. Tip number 10, the plate, not the clipper machine, but the plate should be 2 to 4 inches below your elbow. Tip number 11, this was interesting to me. 98% of all blade failures is due to the cutter blade, not the comb. So if you test a clipper blade, it doesn't work, just pull the cutter out and look at it, maybe redo it. And also the trick of just pulling out the cutter allows you to look at the spring, because maybe that spring is off. So that'll save you a lot of time rather than having to totally disassemble a blade when it doesn't cut and it doesn't pass and test. Just slide the cutter out and test that. So that's clipper blade information. What's my next ones here? So Cliff Curry, first time I've met him, he's from Hawaii, and it was on knives. I didn't get a lot of tips from him because knives are so new to me. I thought it was interesting how he said that a decreased angle, a more acute edge. Now, knife angles and scissor angles are the opposite, so I don't want to confuse you or me. But the more acute the angle, he said even on cheap steel, the longer that blade edge will last. Who knew? He said it's been proven. He said that once you get to where the metal is chipping or rolling, that's when you know you've gone beyond whatever that knife will take. And he was talking about like 12 to 13 degrees. See, I've never sharpened knives that fine, so that was something I'll have to try. I thought it was interesting that he talked about sharpening, and this applies to sharpening in general, is science and art. It's a science of sharpening, it's the art of sharpening. Science has to do with the angles and the matter and the type of the steels and this type of thing. And the art has to do with the muscle memory and the pressure. That was number 4. He said he sharpened machetes to 18 degrees with a mirror polish convex, and they work better. Number 5, he talked a lot about edge leading and edge trailing. That means like if you're sharpening, like let's say you're sharpening by hand, or maybe this is a belt sander. Edge leading would be you're going into, this is moving to you like this, edge leading, and then edge trailing is this way. So our shears, we always do them edge trailing. Knives, I've always done them edge trailing. It's safer. But he said that the edge leading, you need to always have some kind of fixture to hold it so that it's safe. And that a lot of these guides, once if the knife goes to cut into your disc or whatever, it'll separate and it'll kick the knife off the belt so it doesn't cut in the belt. I don't know. But he said that the edge leading is less heat and it's a little bit more toothiness to the edge. And this is the better way to sharpen harder steels. Passing on what I heard. Like I said, knife sharpening is not my expertise, but I do a lot. Number 6 was the softer steels, you should do them with the edge trailing. And that was the tips I got from Cliff Curry on knives. Now, one of the interesting things I was sitting next to CJ Kerwitz, and I was sitting next to CJ Kerwer, and this might be his idea next to his Sharpener's Jam. But these little sticks like this, he brought me a whole bunch of them. He said this is what he knocks the burr off the knives with. So I'm going to be trying this. Lots of new things to try. My next one, oh, I'm getting close to the end. Oh, I've got Dennis Brooks, and then I have John Kuipers. John talked about being an elite sharpener and how important it was to care for your customers. So his tip number 1 is that corrective sharpening takes more time and more experience, and we all know that's true. Tip number 2 was that only 5% of sharpeners consistently do good work. I'm quoting him. Tip 3, he said the most important thing to be a good sharpener is to care about your customers. And tip 4 is one I got, is that he was able to get an article in behind the chair, and that brought him a lot of mail order sharpening. And that was from John Kuipers. See, I just wrote on the back of these things. Here we go. Dennis Brooks, Hamagori, USA. From Dennis Brooks, who spoke on shear blade anatomy, which was really good. Tip 1 is that when you're sharpening a convex edge, it's important to go all the way to the spine, to the edge, to keep that shape. If you're just constantly just rocking it back just a short ways, you're going to, after a few sharpenings, it'll be kind of bullnose. So to keep the integrity and the style of that blade. Now, if it's a colored one, you can't do that. You got to do them as a bevel, or if it has a name on it, you have to be a little careful with it. But tip number 2, you see how I did not do this very organized. That was tip 1. Oh, here's tip 2. The longer shears need more set or bow to them because the tips are weak, and that the better shears will have less bow, and then we're talking about the curvature of them. Tip number 2. Tip number 3, On the thinners, he says that the straight blade has more bow to it. The teeth blade is more flat. And a lot of times on the thinners, to get them to line up right, those have to be hammered. And that's when you're hammering them, it's going to be just in front of the pivot. Number 4. Oh, I like, well, 4 and 5 go together. And he was talking about number 4 is the inside, the sharpening the inside of the blade correctly will affect the function. So if the inside of the blade is sharpened correctly, the shears will function. The tip number 5, if sharpen the outside of the blade correctly, the shears will perform as they should. So you can do a great job on the inside, do some kind of lousy, crazy angle on the outside, and they'll still cut. But they won't perform like what they originally were. And you can have the outside edge the correct convexing or whatever, and if the inside isn't right, it's not going to work. Number 6, and I've talked about this myself, is that the groomer shears, you don't want to make the edge too smooth. He said that he usually finishes them with like 1,000 grit. And that is the tips that I got from yesterday's convention. And today we're going to be hearing from Judy Brenner. So I'll have another little video on some of those things. That's more the state of the industry and some more business tips. And then I'll also have a video of the presentation that Gina and I did. So I hope these tips were helpful to you. I learned a lot. I really suggest going to these conventions and shows. You'll just absorb so much information, and the tips that I got, there may be other aha moments that you would have that that would strike you that wouldn't necessarily resonate with me, and vice versa. So hope these tips were helpful, and make sure that you subscribe and like and comment about any of these comments. Let me know if you agree with all of them or if you disagree.
Hope all these tricks and little tips that I showed you about sharpening are helpful to you. And if you want to see more, make sure that you subscribe, hit the notification bell. I usually upload about once a week, sometimes more often, so you want to be a part of that. We have a Sharpener's Jam each year, and we also have a Sharpener's Jam group.